Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fourth or fifth meeting, I'm not sure, fifth meeting of the DC Metro Heart Mind IONS community group, and it's a real privilege to be able to host you. My name is Josh Downer, and Dr. Elena Musakova, our typical speaker, is traveling, so I have the honor and the privilege to be able to present to you this evening. And my hope is to discuss some of the broader themes that we have covered thus far and give us an opportunity to, in layman's speak, really synthesize what is it we're doing here, what our purpose is, and then to really kick it to all of you, and maybe I think in this group size we'll split up into two groups, and to have a really in-depth discussion. I've brought some questions for us to consider, really around two broad themes. The first is, what is it that we're doing to transform ourselves? And what does personal transformation look like? And what is the purpose behind it? What are we moving towards? And then secondly, what are we trying to do in society at large? What type of impact are we trying to have on our communities, on our country, and our world? There was this question that kept coming up in Dr. Elena's talks that I actually initially didn't understand what she was saying. She was saying, what is living us? And I remember not knowing what word she was saying, and she was literally using the word living, L-I-V-I-N-G. What is living us? And even after I understood the word, I was still a little bit confused by what she meant. As I pondered it this last couple of weeks in preparation for this evening and reviewed some of her remarks, I realized that what she's talking about is very simply that we don't know who we are. We are moving forward in this continuum of time. And we make decisions, we are doing things, but we don't necessarily know who we actually are. And so there's this decision maker, there are things happening, and we don't know what it is, and it seems to be this embodied entity that is living us, is living our experience, but we don't seem to be in control of it, or at the very least, we don't understand it and aren't able to help cultivate it in a positive trajectory. And so one of the things that we've talked about is the way that our mind works, that our mind creates a paradigm, a typology of experience, and that these concepts become the framework through which we view reality and become the narrative from which we operate. And that there are all sorts of competing narratives in our contemporary society that are pulling at our attention and that are infiltrating our kind of discursive brain that become this framework. So, an example would be consumerism, scientific materialism, religious fundamentalism, nihilism. And that as we move forward in this continuum of time with these competing narratives pulling at us, that we find ourselves increasingly unstable, anxious, and often even depressive, and unable to find grounding or rooting in something that seems true and stable. So in my early life, I can just give you an example of this. In my early life, I was raised in a Christian fundamentalist family. And it was a wonderful family. They were wonderful, loving parents. And I have tremendous love and respect for them and for the community that I was a part of. But I was given a framework for myself and for existence that said that I was a totally depraved human being. And that the only way of attaining salvation was to buy on for a certain set of dogmas. And that if I believed these things and I affirmed these things right here in my head, that this would then have a transformative impact on my heart, and I would become covered from this total depravity. So I would do that. I would say, okay, I believe this, and I would say a prayer, and I really did. I mean, if you asked me, I could have passed a lie detector test that I really did believe these things. But it didn't seem to really make me this loving, compassionate, giving person that I was supposed to, that everyone said this would do, it would make me this wonderful human being. I still felt the same tugs of passion, the same selfishness, the same impulsiveness of any other young kid growing up, in that time period. So I then just kind of created this paradigm that I was fundamentally defective, that I was a defective person, and that this became the sort of prism, the framework through which I viewed myself and the world. And as I grew, I really lost touch with the ability to feel from here, to feel from my heart, and to get to know people, and to even trust what I felt, because I might feel a tug of compassion or the tug of love, but it wasn't necessarily something I could put my trust in because it didn't fit within the framework that I had been given. But that's just one story. So all of us have different frameworks and different narratives. And one of the things that we've talked about in this group is how do we create a language that grounds us in a different narrative, a more true narrative in who we are. But I think one thing we've also talked about is how even obtaining the right quote unquote narrative is not enough, because even if we get the right narrative, that may just be another set of ideas that's operating up here, that's competing with another narrative, and it can be just this ping pong game between different sets of ideas. So one of the things that we've talked about is how through meditative practices and other practices we can quiet the mind and get in touch with the heart. I want to table that for a second and just talk about a little bit of that. I don't want to get too much in the detail of the science because I think we've got a lot of that, but I do want to go over it quickly because I think that it's very informative to this discussion. Quantum physicists realized in the last 100 years that the universe functions like a hologram. And so a holon is a whole that's a part of another whole. And so one way of understanding the human soul, the individual soul, is that it is one holon that's a part of the larger whole of the universe, in which the information and blueprint of the larger one is imprinted on each individual holon within the universe. And so when discussing this from a scientific perspective, we then look at a spiritual text that said, and we spent some time actually meditating on this idea, that said, dost thou think thyself only a puny form, when within thee the whole universe is folded? So this is a scriptural idea that actually has some that scientific theorists are thinking about from a scientific perspective. So when we think about the universe being folded within us, well, in every spiritual tradition, if you think about it, it talks about the heart being the seat of the Holy Spirit. And every religious tradition talks about that. And so, traditionally, religions, we think about this in a metaphorical sense, that the heart, this inner life, that's the Holy Spirit, that we get in touch with God inside. But we've also talked about how groundbreaking studies of the mind have started to realize that there's actually a tremendous amount of energy and power in the physical heart that isn't just metaphorical. And so we talked about this working group that tried to come up with a definition of what is the mind. You think about the mind, you think about the brain primarily, but the mind is actually an embodied process, an entire bodied process of the flow of information and energy that is where information is flowing and information is being exchanged internally, but also between people. They've actually measured that information is being exchanged between people through biophotons, so at the speed of light. So when when you're talking to somebody, you get a really good vibe from them, or you feel like you connect with them, or maybe you're in a room and you feel someone looking at you that you didn't see, right? There's actually scientific evidence for why this exists, because we're interconnected. And that gets at even the very nature of consciousness. We're interconnected, and we communicate to each other through ways that we didn't previously understand. So clinical psychologist Paul Purcell summarizes research in this area as describing that there are really two types of intelligences: brain intelligence and heart intelligence. And so when we talk about meditative and spiritual practices, and we talk about these frameworks that we're trying to quiet, what we're really talking about is quieting the discursive mind, the brain intelligences, so that we can tap into the heart, so that we can tap into what some might call inner vision, which is only possible if we quiet the narrative going on in our heads. Now, what is the point of this, right? Why are we trying to tap into the heart? What happens, right? So the idea is that they've shown that when people are successful in doing this and in aligning their heart and their brain through these practices, that the people who are successful doing it are ones who actively cultivate love, kindness, compassion, and other spiritual attributes. But as we know, these ideas of love is not something that that is purely individual. By definition, love has to have an object that's outside of ourselves, right? If we're just focused on our own growth, on our own person, that's not love. And so this is a fundamentally interpersonal process. So when we talk about trying to cultivate the intelligence of the heart, what we're talking about is cultivating love of the other. And, it was interesting, I was talking to John here earlier, when we were at a previous session, and John mentioned this experiment that he did one time, where he noticed that he had this extraordinary love for his children. And that he decided one day to go on his walk to work and to try to look at each person that he passed with the same love that he felt for his children, and to feel that love toward them. And I don't want to take John's story, but just briefly, he said that as he was walking to work and passing people with this conscious feeling of love toward them, that he felt the palpable reaction that they had to it, that they noticed it, that there was a visible kind of movement that they felt different, and that he could see it. And it was this extraordinary experience. So that really had an impact on me as from a few weeks ago when I heard that. And I was talking to some friends last week about what would it be like to live your life doing that every day with every person that you met, to love them as you loved your closest loved one. And my friend Nadeem, who often comes to these events and isn't able to be here tonight, said that, frankly, if most of us did that in our current states, we would be utterly and totally spent, exhausted within a very short period of time. Because from our current state, we don't have enough love to do that. But then he said something interesting. He said that the people who are able to do that are able to do it because they're not loving from their own store of love. They have become a channel for divine love. And that's infinite. That's inexhaustible. They become a channel through which the infinite love of the universe is just moving through them. So when I think about growth, when I think about the object of personal development, we think about trying to align the brain and the heart through meditative practices, quieting the mind, prayer, and we think, well, what's the goal? I think that that's one way to think about it, is to becoming a channel for this divine universal love that could then flow through us as we go about our life and engage in other people. That's still a very abstract idea. How do we do that? What does that look like? Now, I think that one helpful way to think about the process of development and growth toward what that might look like are the different frameworks for what adult development psychologists call stages of development. And some of you were at a talk that Dr. Elena gave last fall, where she discussed a rubric for the stages of development that she put together. I don't think that she's mentioned this in our groups here, so I will briefly go over it because I think it's a very helpful framework for understanding what it is that we're trying to move toward. So when a baby comes out in the early years, psychologists observe that they enter what's called the impulsive stage. Very small babies, they basically are their impulses. Quickly, as they get a little older, they enter what is called the imperial, or what may be called the imperial stage. They are their needs and desires. I want what I want, I'm going to get this, and this is what very, very significantly defines them. By the way, this is just one conception and one kind of title. If you read a lot of adult development psychologists, there's a lot of different terms used for these stages, but they mirror in characteristic the stages that I'm describing to you. So you have the impulsive stage, then the imperial stage. And then as you move into adolescence, it can be observed that adolescents enter what can be understood as the interpersonal stage, where, and this stage is characterized by, you define yourself by what other people think of you. You're very conscious of what other people think of you, and this can lead to either on one hand extreme conformity, wanting to fit in, or on the other hand, wanting to stand out as a radical self-expression. It can express itself different ways, but the interpersonal stage is a stage characterized by you are what people think of you. And then many, not all, but many people continue to progress to what may be called the institutional stage. And this stage is characterized by attaining a static set of beliefs, associations, a career, an identity, the institutional stage. You are your political opinions, you are your job, you are your denomination, etc. And many people never proceed beyond this stage. I mean, this characterizes perhaps 40-50% of the country we live in terms of the kind of general stage of development that they obtain to. And then beyond that, the next stage can be understood, or what might be described as the inter-individual stage. Now, this is an interesting stage of development, inter-individual. So before you had the interpersonal, this is the inter-individual. So this stage is you can imagine someone who has a core set of beliefs and values, but they start to develop the capacity for deep listening, where as they interact with people, they're able to really seek to understand who they are and even incorporate that person's views, opinions, experiences into their own identity that can then help them evolve and grow on their path. So a quick example from earlier discussions. Remember that river of development where on one side you had the rigidity and on the other side you had chaos, and you were progressing on this is an image that Dr. Elena used, progressing on this river, and you want to stay between rigidity and chaos. We can think of the inter-individual stage as someone who has really gotten into a pretty good place of proceeding down this river where they're neither too rigid in their beliefs or their identity, but they're also not chaotic. They've got a person an ego understanding and a personhood that's developing. And then from here one arrives, if they proceed further, at what can be understood as the authentic self. And the authentic self is the peak of this first tier of development. And I think that the authentic self could best be described as the acronym that Dr. Elena gave us. Remember, she talked about coherence, and she said that there's an acronym for someone who's connected, open, harmonious, receptive, engaged, noetic, meaning having a sense of knowing, compassionate, empathetic. These are the characteristics of a healthy person, a healthy, authentic person. And the authentic self represents the culmination of ego development. But that's just the peak of the first tier of development. That then becomes a foundation for another set of stages of development that are characterized by ego transcendence. So if this is the culmination of ego development, then what begins is a period of ego transcendence. And different developmental psychologists, Ken Wilber, many others, describe specific stages after that. But the culminating stage at the conclusion of that, people have described as unity consciousness. And at that stage of development, some have described it as pure light. And when we talk about this idea of becoming a pure channel for divine love, the divine attributes of God, those are the types of characteristics that we begin to really see as one progresses beyond ego development to the stages of ego transcendence. If you think of the great saints, the great mystics, the Rumis, the Gandhis, etc., they exhibited those sorts of characteristics of ego transcendence. So I want to pause here and give us a chance to have a conversation. And if we have time, we'll come back and talk about sort of external purpose, social change. But I want to take a moment here to think about several questions that I posed to you. And one, the first would be, what are the narratives that we have, that are frameworks for living, and what do we do to challenge them? And I'm actually going to give you a handout, so you don't have to write these down. Second is, I'm really curious to hear about people's own personal practices. What are your spiritual practices, meditative practices that you use to challenge, to quiet maybe some of the narratives, or maybe you don't even think about that, or maybe think about it a different way, but to connect with your heart and to foster those spiritual attributes. So what are your own personal practices? And then I wanted to ask a question related to this idea of deep listening. I guess I need to define it real quick. I mentioned deep listening as a characteristic of the interindividual stage. Um, you know, most people when we listen, and I'm guilty of this regularly, is someone's talking to you and you're listening, and you sort of stream everything they're saying through this filter of, do I agree with what they're saying? Do I disagree with what they're saying? Have I heard this before? What do I know about this? And then you're thinking about what you're going to say back. It's kind of this narrative in your head, and sometimes you can completely lose track of even what they're saying as you're thinking about what you're thinking about in response to what they're saying. And I think that this characteristic of deep listening is really completely making silent that narrative, and just being there, being present, and trying to take in what they're trying to truly understand them, independent of your own narrative in your head. And so I would pose just a question of, is that something that resonates with you, and are there any strategies or anything you've ever done to try to connect with people on that deeper way, to try to listen in that deeper way? So let's take a break and break up in maybe 2 small groups, and I will distribute these questions. So we had a great discussion. I think that it's interesting having a little more time to go around and to keep kind of pondering the questions. I think it was interesting to hear different conceptions of the way that we each relate to God, and ways we think about ourselves in relation to God. And I think that John had this paradigm where he says, where is the edge of God? And he's not able to find one. And so this idea that in this holographic universe, that if we're part wholes in this greater whole, then when we live connected to that greater whole, then in his experience, that love that we described, it's inexhaustible. It's not. It isn't something that runs out. And he also described interacting with people, approaching people with kind of all these preconceived narratives. And one practical suggestion that he had was just putting it in a shoebox in his head, and putting it in a closet, closing the door, and then going in with a blank slate, and trying to. We discussed sort of the idea of how we try to do that with everyone. And of course, there may be contexts, and professional contexts, certain type of scientific situations where that isn't the approach that we'd use, but as a good starting point. So that's a great segue into what I wanted to bring our thoughts to at the conclusion of this meeting, which is, how do we think about this approach in the context of social change in our communities? And one of the interesting paradigms that I've seen in developmental psychology thinks about not just stages of growth, as we talked about earlier, stages of growth in consciousness or identity, but also the quadrants of reality. And in the quadrants of reality, you can look at every phenomena as having an internal subjective element, so our thoughts, our ideas, our values, an internal objective element, so in the case of the person, that would be our limbic system, our brain, our chemicals, etc. And there would be the external subjective, so shared values, intersubjective norms between people, and then external objective, which would be language, the rules of a gathering or a context, the institutional setup. So we think about our society, and we think about what it is that shapes our environments. To make this more simple rather than the whole quadrant, let's think of 2 things: the intersubjective norms, the values, the shared ideas, the things that are kind of the softer things that define who we are, and then the external objective things. What are the actual institutional environments that we're in? What are the rules that govern them? What is the language that we use? And this is something that Dr. Elena has talked about considerably, is the languages that define our existence. What do we speak in a language of consumerism? Do we speak in a language of zero sum, of competition, of winning and losing? Or do we speak a language that's different than that? What might a different language look like? And so spiritual languages and this conversation of trying to integrate consciousness, science, and spirituality is an attempt to create a different language, different discourse. It's also a different type of environment. It's a physical environment that we gather together with its own values, etc. But we can take that framework to everywhere we go, our family, our communities, our larger communities in our country, and in the globe that we live in. And so I guess, something to ponder. I'm not sure we have too much time to discuss it before we wrap up here, but I had some questions to end on, and what institutions, structure, environments are available to us to serve as holy environments for this forward motion of personal growth that we have been discussing about. Because that's really what a holy environment, that's what we're talking about, is a holy environment, something where we can contribute, where something can push back and challenge us, but it remains present. And that it can remain present as we progress in all these stages of growth. And what kind of language must they employ in order to be effective? What type of languages do we use in these environments in order to facilitate this forward motion of growth? And finally, what would the shared values and norms be to characterize them in order to facilitate this type of motion of growth? So I think that I'll leave it there, and thank you all very much for coming and for sharing this evening with us together, and we will look forward to some brief fellowship here at the end, and we can talk about those ideas and questions or not, and talk about whatever else. And we will be back in 2 weeks, where Dr. Lana will be back with us. So thank you.